Welcome to this Janice Lee reading and Janice Lee and Brandon Shimoda conversation. My name is Jay Ponteri. I'm the chair of Low Residency Creative Writing here at PNCA, and I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that the land where I'm located rests on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Malala, bands of the Chinook, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. I also acknowledge the systemic policies of genocide, relocation, dislocation, assimilation that still impact many indigenous Native families today. As settler and guest on these lands, we respect the work of Native nations and First Peoples, leaders and families, and make ongoing efforts to center indigenous knowledge, creativity, resilience, and resistance. We acknowledge that this acknowledgement is not enough and is one of many steps leading towards the more active, essential task of the rematriation of Native lands. Before I introduce our writing fellow, I wanted to let you all know about some upcoming creative writing events. From January 2nd to January 12th, 2022, we will be having our creative writing residency. And that includes faculty readings and talks by Brandon Shimoda, Sarah Jaffe, Allison C. Rollins, Pupe Masagi, Alejandra D'Acosta, Kristen Bradshaw, and myself. Our guest artist this January is the short story writer Venita Blackburn. So I'll be sending out lots of notices about that. So that's upcoming. I would like to introduce critical studies student and writing fellow, Justin Duyao. I forgot to mention, Janice is awesome, by the way, and we're selling some of her books in the back. So after the reading, feel free to check out the book selection. You can Venmo Janice directly some money, and I'm sure she would love to sign your copies. So I just want to encourage that. Okay, here's Justin.
Hello, everybody. Just to orient yourself, I'm going to introduce Brandon and Janice. Janice is going to read from her recent publication, Imagine a Death, and then her and Brandon will both enter into a conversation via Zoom. So that's where we're headed. Brandon Shimoda is a Yonsei poet and writer and the author of 7 books of poetry and prose, including The Grave on the Wall, which received the PEN Open Book Award, and Evening Oracle, which received the William Carlos Williams Award from the Poetry Society of America. His book on the afterlife of Japanese American incarceration received a creative nonfiction grant from the Whitting Foundation and is forthcoming from City Lights. He received an MFA in creative writing at the University of Montana and is an assistant professor of creative nonfiction at Colorado College. Janice Lee is a Korean-American writer, editor, teacher, and shamanic healer. She is the author of 7 books of fiction, creative nonfiction, and poetry, including KEROTAKIS, Daughter, Damnation, Reconsolidation, The Sky Isn't Blue, Imagine a Death, and Separation Anxiety, which is forthcoming. A roundtable, Unanimous Dreamers Chime In, a collaborative novel co-authored with Brenda Iijima, is also forthcoming in 2022 from Meekling Press. She writes about interspecies communication, plants and personhood, the filmic long take, slowness, the apocalypse, architectural spaces, inherited trauma, and the concept of Han in Korean culture, and asks the question, how do we hold space open while maintaining intimacy? Incorporating shamanic and energetic healing, she teaches workshops on inherited trauma, healing, and writing, and practices in several lineages, including Kero Buddhism, plant and animal medicine, and Korean shamanic ritual, Muism. She is founder and executive editor of Entropy, co-publisher at Civil Coping Mechanisms, and co-founder of the Accomplices. She currently lives in Portland, Oregon, where she is an assistant professor of creative writing at Portland State University, and she can be found online at janicel.com. So without further ado,
Hello. Hi. How is everyone doing? Good. Thank you so much all for being here. Oh, hi, Cole. Thank you, Justin, for that introduction. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, everyone who helped make this possible. And so I'm going to read. Oh, actually, I was going to say something. So I have some tarot cards in the back. So where the books are, there's these pink cards back there. They're free. So if you want to take one, please feel free to take one before you leave tonight. And they're all the ones that I have left. I had many more, and I saved these for this event today in person. So I'm going to read a few excerpts from this novel, Imagine a Death, that just came out. And I'll just say a few things. So it takes place in a time that might seem a little bit apocalyptic, but is not actually so different from the time that we live in, I think. There's 3 human characters, a writer, a photographer, and an old man who are all dealing with their own traumas and woundings in their own way and are entangled, just entangled with each other and with the world and with everything. And there's also a lot of plants and animals and other beings that make appearances. And today, I'm going to read mostly from the animal points of view. But also I want to acknowledge that the bulk of the writing in this book is about the humans. They take up the most space. I don't want to misrepresent the book. But the humans are kind of harder to read out loud. So I will read a little bit about the humans. But just to say that, and yeah. So this first one I'm going to read is called The Squirrels. The squirrels remember in decades. That is, while they breathe circles into the winter air, one will slip down the muddy walkway and have his spine pressed upright by a memory of running forward, dry cough and chilly wind like needles, showing up for another on a street corner in the dead of night. This isn't his memory, but he recognizes the early morning vibration, the ground shaking, the sky shaking his feet, and he knows that in order to appreciate the sun, he will need to traverse the street and be elated, at least momentarily, by the unused water pooling on the side of the street. He sees the other squirrel when the crow starts clicking, sitting atop a wire and the sun finally blazing down to proceed into day. It is day. The squirrel approaches the other, and cheeks wriggling and butt smashing into the grass, he presses the palm of his hand into her chest and her mouth rewinds. The arms might lose themselves in dreams, but the squirrels always know where they are. When one is no longer visible to the other, there is no crying, but a shouldering of the post and the fullness of survival that contracts and protracts with the waning and waxing of the moon. He knows not to demand, and she knows not to wait up. This comes from experience, from decades of memory. After all, if they are running in circles and up and down trees, the memories ought to loop in figure-8 patterns as well, so when creatures grind their teeth, it is not only during evening slumber. Should I adjust this a little bit? It's a little fine? Is this a little bit better, maybe? Okay. This next one is from the point of view of the dog. There is the veering in my nostrils. It's the season of death and resurrection, but what season isn't? She veers, is veering, but if she misses anybody, it is the ghost that becomes an intimate confidence. I wish she could understand how gracefully we can slide into the images of dirt here. That the mountains speak, but she cannot hear them. We are all veering constantly, and to be alone doesn't mean to be dejected, but still with each other. She lives by mirages, but realizing that the mirages and the everything else are becoming each other constantly, and that her reflection is constantly becoming her, just as she is constantly becoming her reflection. There are certain things I have become accustomed to. I don't know why I bite. I don't miss anybody because I don't know how, but I know what I am attached to, and that is everything. Who ever said it was easy to understand their real self? A dog, probably, but at least this is a wonderful place to be unhappy in. And because I read the dog, I will read the cat. The eclipse is silent, and though totality only lasts for a few moments, the details continue to fall one after the other around you. And it is only because the sun has foreseen the fall. To be a memory and to be alive are one and the same thing, so when we move from here to there, we know that life is a series of breaths. To see a perspective only when the seer and the seen are perfectly aligned, that is, to be in a position to be able to see and to want to see. The humans know that a lunar eclipse occurs only when the sun, earth, and moon are aligned in syzygy, our home planet's shadow creeping across the moon until the moon appears red because our atmosphere acts as a filter for the sun's light. Or that during a solar eclipse, one should never look directly at the sun. But things aren't so extreme. What will you say to me? Though the spiders may begin to dismantle their webs in the middle of a day, and the dog may howl before the rains come, the transition between light and dark is the transition between life and death, is the journey of living itself, is this, all of this, that the measure of being worthy of belonging to the land is the measure of sight. We have not arrived yet at the stage of facing each other straight on, because there is still that lingering feeling of guilt. But all along, you were planning on saying something else. Still, we are all here, watching, judging. This is the whales. And this particular chapter holds a special place in my heart because it is dedicated in part to J35, also known as Taliqua, the killer whale who, was it a few years ago? Now, I don't know what time is. She was carrying her baby upon her dead baby upon her back for a couple of weeks. She gave birth to a new baby earlier this year. But also the humpback whales that save our entire planet in Star Trek's A Journey Home. So this is for all of those whales. What is the pattern of predictable sounds that, in its steadfast refusal to cooperate with its interpreters, shakes you at your chest, wraps its oral tendrils around your waist, and asks, "What do you see in your future?" She was seized by the fullness of survival, and as the last boat sped past, she gritted her teeth and shouldered her body next to her mother's, seams of space closed off by flesh. And as the water began to clear, she was able to see again. She scooted up to look into her mother's eyes, and the eyes let her know they had seen everything they needed to see, or there had been nothing to see at all. They had in the past days seen many of their friends disappear or leave. Any insistence on coalition heard silence. And there were less and less tiny things to swallow up, less and less places to hide, large from those that lurked in the shadows above the shadows, so that swimming to the surface to watch the dust dancing in the sun was no longer a relished pastime. Her mother had tried to remain connected with the others, but they were afraid that her visions had been a bad omen, that there were so few of them now because of what she had seen, and that they would better fend for themselves far away from her connection with the kingdom of the dead. She had now known that before her there had been another who had died before even seeing the sky, and that her mother had carried that other upon her back for several days, the others urging her to let go. But how does one let go of everything? How does one simply allow for such finality when it is a piece of you that must be discarded and dropped into the sea? I won't pass this on to you, I promise, her mother would whisper every evening. Especially on full moons, she would watch her mother's eyes cloud over, tongue tucked back and voiceless, but water running along the contour of her massive body. And her mother would hum as the moonlight rode over her skin, and when her eyes cleared like the water, and when she spoke again, it was always the same. She didn't want to confess to her mother that she had started to feel the shudders too, that sometimes during the rainstorms she could feel a tiny voice like a grain of rice trying to reach her lips, her resistance making the voice more insistent. And though she wasn't afraid, she didn't want to worry her mother. Her mother knew enough deaths, had enough ghosts following her, hated knowing the fate and endangerment of their kind, but without the others could do nothing about it except to sing. That eerie melody that carried through the water and over the surface, drew air currents and upward into the atmosphere, the kind of melody that human composers strove for years to construct, but here it poured out of her. More than just a song, but a lament, an intimate tether to all other forms of life, a resonance that even the pigeons with their blank stares roosting on telephone wires would feel, but perhaps not be able to parse, yet this wasn't a sound to be parsed out or interpreted. It was meant to be heard and received and felt and transposed into tears or waves or touch, the openness of a broken heart. Another day ended and the light bounced off of the trembling surface, 2 whales bobbing under the starlight. I like the night up here, she said. We can see the stars. They are not our stars, her mother responded. Both knew more than they let on to the other, and when the blue of the night finally ran out, they awoke to another boat passing overhead. She didn't know why, but this time, instead of swimming deeper and hiding, she had a feeling penetrate and a voice that ebbed inside her like the tide, and so in a flurry she turned to her mother and only whispered, "Don't worry," as she swam upward to meet the dangling hand slowly slicing the water. The hand connected to a little girl was gentle. The little whale jumped up, and the girl beamed in excitement, though the girl wasn't alone. There were 2 men with her, each with various recording devices and other equipment, and they spoke words to each other, and the girl responded, and as more lights turned on, the girl leaned into the water, put her hand on the whale again, and said simply, "Don't worry." The whale bobbed there for a moment longer, the girl's hand still resting gently on her head, and when the girl finally removed her hand, the little whale ducked her head underneath the water and returned to find her mother. That night, the girl and the men would hear the whale singing. "They are singing to save the world, the entire world," she would say. And the men, with their fragile devices and advanced machines, would record the music and nod in agreement but say nothing, just nodding from time to time as the songs would create spikes of different heights on their screens. All of the lamentations of 2 grieving souls seeking intimacy, articulated in the rise and fall of jagged black lines. And somewhere out there, the whales would swim and sing because they were alone, but with each other, a reminder that loss and exile are linked. And the sound was a way to stay connected with the movement of their bodies through the water and the air and the sky and the tremblings of the earth and the breaths of all the living beings. And that night, there were more lights in the sky, even more stars being born, and an unanswerable tether to time. This is the dream. In a dream, there is a girl who encounters a large bear in the woods. And the bear, in its insistence at being a bear, stands tall and growls menacingly to warn the girl to turn back and go home. And the girl, in its insistence at being a girl who still falls asleep gripping her teddy bear, tightly moves closer, wondering how soft the bear's fur might be, and the bear, though confused but gripped with his own intentions and narrative, bares his teeth, and the girl runs forward, squealing and giggling, and wraps her arms around one of the bear's legs and feels the rough fur on her cheek and a strange but not unfamiliar odor emanating from his body, and the bear slowly leans down and strikes the girl, who is still hugging him tightly with his claws, and discards the little body into the river, where it stains the surrounding water red and redder. And what the girl had thought to herself just before she was killed was how much coarser the fur had felt than she had expected, but still the warmth was comforting, and that she could have fallen asleep right then and there. So the last chapter I'm going to read, and it's a little longer one, and it's the writer. And I have not read this out loud before, and it's actually the very final chapter of the book, but I don't really believe in spoilers, so this is the last chapter. And it circles on the writer. And I'm also reading this because Brandon and I were talking about the last two words of this, so maybe it'll come up in our conversation. But yeah, this is also for Brandon. The writer. The clock on the wall gently ticks as a reminder of continuance. And as she stands in the doorway, the window open and a slight breeze blowing the curtains from side to side, she sees laid out on the kitchen counter the cedar needles and leaves and bark she had harvested the previous day. After, in a dream, the recipe for the cedar tea that her mother had made for her as a child had resurfaced serendipitously. And though she knows that out here in this quiet place she is learning slowly, but that also it is far more important to learn that there is something yet to learn in the first place. And in the woods, among the trees, there is indeed still so much yet to learn. And as she sets out on her task in preparing the bark, she remembers learning the various parts of speech, particularly the difference between nouns and verbs, and after school explaining to her mother what she had learned, that nouns were people, places, or things, and that verbs were actions. But as she grew older, these distinctions had become murkier. That is, why were people and things in separate categories anyway, and why were verbs so much about movement or things happening, she would wonder. And as she saw the distinctions to be limiting, would attempt to reorient these categories of existence in her writing exercises at school, writing, for example, "Today is excited to be Friday." And her teacher would correct her and explain that one couldn't personify today, and that it would be simpler and more correct to write, "I am excited that today is Friday." But the writer would explain that there was an important difference in declaring that it was Friday as a fact, thus dismissing the unique state of existence of today being Friday, that it wasn't her own excitement she wanted to convey in the sentence, but time itself, that the day as a durational period of time existed in a state of being Friday for only a temporary feeling of time before it would then become Saturday. And this wasn't so different from a human feeling a particular emotion like sadness for a period of time, after which they might become more hopeful. But the teacher, without any adequate explanation, simply stated she couldn't write sentences that way, that it just wasn't the way language worked, And so the writer realizes that she is, in some ways, recovering from the placement of these kinds of restrictions on her relationship with the world. That is, though her teacher had simply seen language as a logical system with certain rules to be followed, she had felt language as an extension of her own ability to see and feel and to be able to articulate those experiences somehow with others. And now, with the breeze blowing in and causing some of her hair to fall over her face, she blows out of the side of her mouth in an attempt to blow her hair out of her face. Her hand still preoccupied with the cedar, and she can hear the clock ticking, but not much else, not even the birds. And because she is still recovering from the effects of the accumulation of all of the experiences in her life, these great and joyous and traumatic and mysterious experiences, she finds that she can't locate the right words in this moment to articulate the imagining of a future that is her own. That is, not the future in which she is dead already, or even dying, but a future in which she is older than she is now and no longer imagines what a future death would look like, but simply waits. The kind of waiting that is steadfast and a stand in the name of life itself and feels a little shaken. Not greatly, but just a little, because she feels for a moment not herself, and her only excuse for feeling this way is that she has never made this tea by herself before, and perhaps there is some kind of unconscious nostalgia or connection to her mother that has taken over her body. But in honesty, she does feel herself, but also somehow a future ghost of who she might be if she continues to keep arriving at this point. That is, the point of continuing to want to become rather than the inclination to give into the depths of finality. And as she imagines what she might look like as an older woman, she imagines how much she resembles her mother, how much she will resemble her mother. And as she continues to stand there in this strange transitional state, her hands still working as if the recipe has resurfaced inside the physical memory of her body, her new lover walks in and embraces her from behind, smiling, and she is surprised at his easy affection, and he leaves her to what she is doing. He believes in the possibility of simultaneous codependency and independence, and until she had met him, she had forgotten what peace with another person might feel like. The kind of care for another being that doesn't conflict with one's own right to exist. And one night, when she had confided in him about her own painful past and her desire to move past these tethers, not to forget them or to make them disappear, but to move forward in a way that felt compassionate toward both herself and to those around her. And he had told her that he loved her, and she had found it easy to say she loved him too, and he had asked if he would continue to love her. And she had replied that it wasn't her right to give that kind of permission, and he had said that the permission she would grant would be in terms of the kind of proximity that she wanted to put between them. And she had nodded genuinely, somehow both afraid and hopeful for everything that lay in store for her. And she tries to listen to her heart, how it is beating, why the strange feeling as if she is somehow hovering ever so slightly above her body, looking down at herself, busily preparing. And she remembers the many moments in which she felt she absolutely had to die because life had somehow become too much or too little, or she had wanted in some way to face a different kind of eternity. But that now she could see so much more, and even the air, all of the space that emanated around her and from her, moving in all directions. Not the tortured landscape of the city, but not the city itself, just her involvement and interpretation of it as a ruined place, and she could feel somehow a future self emanating from one of those directions. She didn't know how to explain clearly, even to herself, that she wasn't simply imagining with some kind of easy curiosity or wonderment at what she would be like in 30 years, but that she somehow was embodying a kind of remembering of the possibility of a future. That feeling of how it would be to be that future self. And from that point, in an imagined but possible future, not so far from death, but not under the grip of its ominous shadow, she saw the possibility of family, of knowing what it might mean to create life and to see it grow. And then to understand the kind of loss that parents might feel when they outlive their own children. And she saw the possibility of the admiration of birds, perhaps a significant or sentimental image of one hanging on the wall. And she saw the possibility of numerous trips to various destinations around the world, the piecing together of acceptance of her own self through the understanding of physical distance. And she saw the possibility of assembling the kind of story that might hold all of these experiences simultaneously, the book being extraordinary and moving and received by numerous others in a way that might finally convince her that writing really could be beautiful and compulsive, even just for herself. And she saw the possibility of a kind of arrival in a place where there might be a plaque on a wall, her fingers running over the etched drawings and letters, a kind of imprecise memorial to her own loyal and resolute dog, the one life that had made the most difference to her when it had mattered, though she would not know for some time just how much he had done for her. And then she remembered saying goodbye to a friend one afternoon in a cafe who was flying across the world the next day in order to pursue an alternate treatment to the aggressive cancer that was killing her. And she remembered reading about the final collapse of her childhood city in the desert, a great earthquake swallowing up what had remained of the great metropolis and the rest falling into the sea. And she remembered when the government had issued a state of emergency decades before and how, like the wind, things had continued the way they had for some time. And she remembered when a fire had broken out in the forest and had destroyed thousands of acres of trees and her cabin in the woods and the garden she had cultivated for years. And she remembered the countless times she had imagined that it was the end. And all of the times she had managed on, and she remembered once on a plane, the moment the plane began to descend beneath the clouds. And one moment she could see the brightly lit and expanding city unfolding out below her, a brilliant landscape of lights and systemized movement. But then, a moment later, the plane began to dip below the clouds, and in that stretched out moment of time, it felt as if everything slowed down and expanded around her, crushing her with the expanded space, the suffocating largeness of it all, the claustrophobic realization of space and height and her place on that plane, with all the people sitting there in their seats around her, her eyes locked onto the dismal and thick, thick white outside the window, looming and full. And a momentary lapse in sight that was, in its own way, a kind of opening of vision, a revelation. And when the apocalyptic moment passed and the city burst forth again beneath the clouds, and the familiar brightness reminded her that no time had passed at all, not really, but also knowing that she had lived an eternal purgatory in that moment, as if alone and shivering and quivering in the corner of a tiled shower, the water pouring down, and she, a body that could only shake and absorb the water through her skin as the tears rolled out of her eyes. And when her feet were on the ground again, she only thought of the immensity and magnificence of the sky. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
We're going to just take a minute to situate the conversation. Yeah, if you want to grab the microphone too, Janice. Great reading. Brandon, can you see Janice?
I can. Yeah, hi.
Brandon, I'm
Can
going
you
to
he-
turn the computer so you can just quickly see the audience, okay?
So can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm simultaneously behind you, Janice, and also in front of you.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're really big behind me. You're
Oh
like
yeah, how
gigantic.
terrifying. Um, it's so wonderful to be back in conversation. So it was July of 2019 when we were at Powell's, and you were talking to me about my book. So 2.5 years later, 2 incredibly auspicious years later. I love imagining. It's a very selfish imagining that my book could exist alongside your book. I'm curious. You said that you haven't read that last chapter. I mean, maybe you've read it to yourself, but you haven't read it out loud to an audience before.
No, I haven't. And I mean, for a few different reasons. I think there's like a taboo, like you're not supposed to read the ending of your novel, right? Like you're supposed to get people to buy it to figure out what happens at the end. But it's not like there's a big reveal, right? But also that whole chapter is one sentence. And so it's like breathing practice. Like I feel like I can go swimming after this or something.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, maybe there's a big reveal at the end. It's possible.
Maybe.
You used the word apocalyptic, but so how did it feel sharing that chapter?
It felt fine. I mean, I view the ending, like you're right. I mean, there is some kind of reveal. There are revelations, and there's revelations throughout the book. But for me, the revelation is about the arrival back itself, right? There's not like a new thing. There's not like it's not like a metamorphosis type book. It's about like, how do you come back to the self, having moved away, but you're still coming back. And I think there's a lot of ways to read that ending, but in some ways, also much of what I read hasn't happened yet. Like it's all an imagined future, remembering from the future. And so it's also all speculative. It's also all imagined.
I was thinking, this chapter in a way is sort of like metonymic on the book as a whole. I was thinking it's the kind of book that one would need to write in order to write anything else, but simultaneously the book that one writes towards, if that makes sense. And then this chapter felt the same way, and I was curious, just in terms of your process, because it feels like the sort of chapter that you have to arrive at. That it might be very difficult to just sit down and write a chapter like this without having lived the previous chapters, but maybe that's wrong. Where in the order of things did this chapter get written?
It was written near the end. I think there were bits and pieces, like the parts where the writer is reflecting on grammar. A lot of that is inspiration from a lot of other writers, like Robin Wall Kimmerer, for example. And I think I had pieces of that before, but the last, the last bit of it came very, very close to the end. And when I wrote it, I wasn't thinking this was going to be the ending, but it felt like an ending. And so I kind of held on to it, like maybe this is the ending. But this whole book feels like I needed a lot of experience to be able to write it. Like there's no way I could have written this book like 10 years ago. It feels like I have to have written everything that I've already written in order to even begin to know how to write this. And I didn't know how to write this when I wrote this. It just came out. I had absorbed all of these things in some way, but I wasn't thinking about it intentionally like I had with my past work. And so there was something that was like going on inside my body, and my body was like, this is now the thing that comes after all these things. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, thinking of endings, do you feel like some part of you came to an end with this book?
Kind of. I mean, like, it's so hard to write, if I'm frank now. Like, since that book, like, it's really hard for me to write sentences. I wrote a collection of poetry,
during the pandemic after this, but then that's what's coming out next year. But that was like my break from this novel. Like, and, you know, though there can be prose poetry, of course, like I really needed to write poems that had lots of line breaks and not long lines. Like I really needed a break from the long sentences. But besides that, I have written very, very little in the past 2 years. And I will accept that.
Yeah, I mean, you think like there's a book like Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and you think, well, what do you do after you write a book like that? And I don't know if you can measure it in terms of I wrote very little or I wrote a lot. It seems like there's some other kind of process going on. So you did mention that the book, the chapter ends and the book ends with the words "the sky." And it's true, we were talking about that a couple nights ago. So because you mentioned it, I have to address it. And it's not just the final two words of the book, but the sky, it's more than a feature, it's more than a companion. There's something very disarming about the sky throughout. So here are just like a couple of lines. When she was just a little girl, her mother was killed by a strange object that had fallen from the sky. That's page 27. She knew to fear the sky. That's page 31. She dips her pen into the murdering sky and thinks on her mother, page 47. When she thought about her childhood, it was the terror of the sky that overshadowed any moments of familial intimacy, page 99. The collapsible and impossible sky, 107. The sky of perpetual burning, 109. And then, of course, the sky, the last two words. The sky often appears orange, which I suppose you could associate with burning. You wrote a book called The Sky Isn't Blue. What's the deal?
I mean, I do have an obsession with the sky, but until you read all those quotes, I was like, oh, the sky in this book's actually really violent. Like, because I mean, I think of the sky as like, oh, it can be many things. It can be all of these things at once. But, you know, at least for this character, because of this one event, like, so her mother died really violently because just an object randomly falls out of the sky, and she's the one who discovers the body. And that colors a lot of what comes after, right? Because she has to grow up as an orphan. And I just think about like these events, like, okay, well, if that can come out of the sky, what else can come out of the sky? And having lived in Los Angeles for 11 years, like the sky, you know, is also full of pollution and it's full of ash after the fire, right? But it also is like where the rain comes from. And in, you know, unlike Portland and LA, when it rains, we dance, like it's like a miracle, right? It's like a ceremony. We have to really be thankful for the rain. And so it's all of these things, but I also think about the sky as a portal. It's a portal to everything. It's a portal to life. It's a portal to death. It's a portal to everything that is unknown, quite literally, like to the rest of the universe, but also as a way to think about everything that we're not able to face, and yet the sky is always there, regardless of its state or color or what it's bringing. It's undeniable that it exists in some form always, because it's not a tangible thing, right? Like the sky, the color of the sky is only recognizable from a distance. Like if you are in the sky, you don't see the color particles because you're in it. That blue is only recognizable from a distance. And so it's like the sky is not a tangible, it's a space, right? It can only be seen from a distance.
Mm-hmm. All the things that we're not able to face. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Yeah. And what is the sky's relationship to that? I think you just said it, but
the sky's relationship to all the things that we can't face. I think it's just like the sky itself doesn't need to face anything because it is, by definition, it exists in distance to other beings, specifically us humans, right? Like the sky exists in distance or proximity to the earth, but really to humans. And so it's a projection of distance for us to have to ponder. And so it's this thing that we feel like we have to go through, like if we want to go to the moon, and I don't know, you can pay like $29 million or something right now to go to the moon if you want, or something like that, right? So it's like this challenge, or it can be something to be feared, or it can be something that we just embrace. Like this is an unknown thing that we cannot touch, but it's there in the benefits and the, what's the opposite of benefits? The non-benefits. I'm running low on sleep. Anyways.
Yeah. I often wonder why when I'm thinking, I look up at the sky, like, where, I don't know, maybe I'm looking at the ceiling, but, yeah, so this is a question I think I've been wanting to ask you for a while. We both have this great fidelity to this sentence by Adnan. So the book begins with two epigraphs, which are very much related. From William James, A Pluralistic Universe, what really exists is not things made, but things in the making. Mm-hmm. And then the sentence that that I think we both kind of share like a relationship with is, we are all contemplatives of an ongoing apocalypse. Mm-hmm. And that's from Attel's short story, Master of the Eclipse. Mm-hmm. And I think you taught a class once. Was it like apocalyptic writing, or what was that class?
It was a class on the apocalypse, and I've taught it several times, and I will teach it again. It's a class that continues to change. But I'm interested, I mean, like, I do really love apocalypse movies, like when there's like a volcano or like an asteroid is hitting. So I also love the like traditional apocalypse action film. But like as in like narrative and in film, I'm also really interested in apocalyptic films that induce a mood or anxiety that have to do with a different type of reckoning of finality. Because for me, in the West, the apocalypse is so much about an ending, like one ending, right? But that's a really Western notion. Like in other cultures, like there have been many apocalypses already, and there have been many revelations to come out of all of those apocalypses. And it's just this one narrative that we put a lot of stock in, like, when is the apocalypse coming? And so we just kind of explore that concept. Like, what is the vantage point of the apocalypse? What is at stake in thinking about the apocalypse in all these ways? And why might we be attached so much to finality and linear time? Yeah.
Yeah, do you, I think one thing I'm curious about is, well, just in general, we are all contemplatives of an ongoing apocalypse. One, what does it mean to be, what might it mean to be a contemplative of the apocalypse? Is it something we're already kind of like inaugurated into by virtue of being alive, or is it a particular orientation and commitment? It certainly seems so in your work that it's like a particular orientation and commitment, but what does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, for me, partially it means that there's a constant, there's a constant thinking about or having feelings about an ending that is about to come, whether it is an apocalyptic event or it's the end of one's life. And I like the sentence in particular because it doesn't assign a value to that state. It's not like we should fear the apocalypse, like we're all contemplatives and we need to fear the apocalypse, or like we need to do something about it. It's just like an acceptance. Like we're all dealing with this thing that is going to happen, and there's no like value associated with it, which is so interesting to me because usually that's not how people talk about the apocalypse or apocalypses. And I think there's like an acceptance that can be there. It doesn't have to be something to be resisted. Like contemplating the apocalypse can be many things. It can be a meditation and an acceptance. It could be a fear or a state of anxiety, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a state of rage or anger or resentment at an end coming, right? It can be like all of these simultaneously. And I think that's the all, right? Like we are all dealing with that in some way, but perhaps in different ways.
Yeah. You prefaced your reading by saying, I think you were referring to Imagine a Death. You said it might seem apocalyptic or like an apocalyptic time, but it is not so different from now. And I suppose in the kind of like strange time frame of this book in which the book exists and the characters exist, this timelessness, it feels like now. I mean, in the ways that you're describing what the apocalypse might be and the way we might contemplate it, that it doesn't seem apocalyptic, but it is.
Yeah, I think. I say that because I think it's like maybe literally on the back of the book that it's about an apocalyptic landscape. I can't remember. And I was thinking about the apocalypse, but I think in very different terms than when people describe like apocalyptic literature or post-apocalyptic literature, right? I think those are often referring to different types of narratives where there's different stakes around like redemption or what happens in an after period. And when I started writing this book, like there were many things happening, and those things have been even more magnified since, so that almost everything that happens in this book is based on something real that has happened, or that had already happened when I wrote it, or happened afterwards, which is very strange because some of these things I thought I like made up, not like, oh, I made these original ideas, but just like, oh, there's this thing, and then they all happen. So just about everything in this book has actually happened now, to some degree, to somebody.
I don't mean to belabor the apocalypse, but maybe it's the only labor to be. But it seems like what your work is doing in part. It's doing so many things, and that's why it's such an incredible experience to enter into it and be in it and think about it afterwards, is that you're closing the distance between the self and what might be construed as apocalyptic. Whereas thinking about like apocalypse movies, the distance between the self and that event or that crisis is so enormous that it enters into the realm of impossibility almost. And that we kind of get this like a giddy charge from imagining the collapse of impossibility into possibility. But what you're writing in many ways seems to be doing is closing that distance and saying it's inseparable. It's inseparable from the self. It's not an action movie. It's very quotidian, in fact. And I think so much of the choreography of this book is moving through that landscape in a way that I think redefines what it means to be a contemplative of the apocalypse.
Yeah, and
seems like.
I think that I love that phrase that you use, like the closing the distance between the self and the apocalypse. I think one of the things I was thinking about is like apocalyptic events are so much seen as like something to be overcome. Like it's a way to show the like triumph of a human or a group of humans, and like how they're going to overcome the odds and how they're going to like, rise to the occasion or whatever. Like there are all these survival narratives that are about heroes, right? And so apocalypse narratives are still hero journey narratives. But there's an interesting stake, and it's to me what's at stake there partially is like, well, if things are gonna suck, then we might as well figure out a way for like us to become better humans, like from this thing that sucks, right? But that's like such a simplified way of thinking about how the world works, because it's so centering like humans as having all the agency to fix things, right? It's like also the way we talk about climate change, where climate change now, like this crisis that we're in, you know, is a crisis and it also isn't. It's actually the accumulation of like lots of time. It's not like this crisis that we're in, and as long as we figure these steps out, like we're going to solve it. It's never going to stop being a crisis, which I think to me is like, well, that's not no longer a crisis. It's a state where we're in an ongoing apocalypse, and figuring out how to fix this problem as if it's something that is a problem that can be solved, I think is not the right way to address it, right? I think that is a different way of replicating the problems that got us here. And I think the pandemic has helped us rethink some of the ways in which we've been thinking about problems and issues, right? Yeah, and I think that's how I think about like that closing the distance that you're talking about, is like what's at stake when we think that humans have agency is not what we think it means.
Do you really think the pandemic has led to us thinking differently?
I mean, I think at least some of us. I think at least some people, right? Like I know, I mean, and I think actually for many people, yes, and we can be in denial of that at the same time, right? Like we can look at this time and be like, okay, the pandemic has showed how all of these things were really not working to begin with, and all of these things are really messed up, and we have to figure out a different way to exist with each other. And we can be in denial because like we really want to go to restaurants and hang out with friends and like have these lives that we used to have, which is also like, oh, well, that also shows how much privilege I have to be, these are the problems that I have. And I still want, like, we can still go back and forth with these, right? I think that's how I think about it, like for myself personally. It's like I, you know, constantly am like, okay, this has really shown us that we need to address this in a different way. And also like, I'm really glad to be able to like go and get breakfast, like with my friend, right? And I can let go of that if I have to.
So this is something I think I had noticed before, but I noticed it again looking through your book. I'm not sure if Justin said this in your bio, but I love that there is within your bio a question, that part of your biography is you asking a question. And the question that's in your bio, which is actually, it's an idea I think that comes up a lot in the book, which is about intimacy. You say, how do we hold, this is in your bio, how do we hold space open while maintaining intimacy? It's a question that you're asking out. It's not a question that you're answering in the bio, but I'm gonna put you on the spot and ask you, how do we hold space open while maintaining intimacy? And maybe even what is the relationship between those two things?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I have an answer to that question, but it's a question that I think about constantly as a writer, as a teacher, as a human being, and that sometimes like thinking about intimacy, which is about bringing people together and closeness and community, also isn't that easy sometimes for people in bodies who have a lot of fear and anxiety of being in those spaces, right? Like, how do you balance the inability actually to be intimate with other bodies and also create intimacy in a safe way, right? It's like kind of how I think about it. I had a thought, but now I totally lost it. I don't know. Say something else, Brandon, and maybe my thought will come back.
I was really, I didn't know you wrote a book of poetry.
I did.
So in the hangover from Imagine a Death, or maybe, I don't know, maybe it already happened, but is that separation anxiety?
Yeah. Yeah.
So you have a book of poetry coming out. That's really exciting. What is that?
It is, it was like me being able to interact with language in a way that didn't have to continue to a period, right? In a way, which, like, you know, I mean, I love sentences, and that was great, and I just needed to have a different relationship to time, and I needed to just be able to use words in a different way. And so some of the themes that come up, like when I started writing the collection, I was anticipating my first dog dying, and then he did, and then I also lost my second dog in the course of this book. So it started off as like, these are poems like that were about the separation anxiety my dog has, like when I leave the house, but also the separation anxiety that I was anticipating for myself, like losing him. And then it became all of these other ways of thinking about separation anxiety.
Yeah. I'm so excited for that. I think this is the first time I've heard of it.
I don't think I've really talked about it very much. Honestly, like, because it is my first official collection of poetry, even though I have published poems before, I feel a little nervous about it, if I'm honest. Like, you know, because I'm not a poet, or I'm not called one. I don't know. Anyways.
Do you really believe that? I mean, when you say that, I guess we're supposed to believe you, but what does that mean? I'm not a poet.
I was being a little facetious. Yeah, I think just like the genre label sometimes, like having a book out there that is like officially called poetry rather than like experimental writing or like some other category, just is a little bit daunting, you know, and especially like all of my friends who are poets, like now that I wrote poems that I'm calling poems, like what are they going to think of me and are they going to judge me? You know, it's like the normal worries that anybody has, right? Like when you put your work out in the world, but I'm very not confident about my poetry.
I would hope that poets especially would be celebrating instead of looking, you know, askance across the table. Not that that's what you said, but that's very exciting. By the way, I gave your book Reconsolidation to a student today who is dealing with a death in the family. One of my favorite books. Feels like I mean, you know, whatever. Prose poetry. I guess it doesn't really matter. But I was thinking about the whale, the orca whale, that you read from tonight, and I was thinking about how that story alone. So right there's this whale. What was the whale's name?
J35 or Taliqua. She has two names.
So
depending on who you ask.
So its child died, and it carried its child on top of it, right?
Yeah.
Like on its back or on its head.
Yeah, and it was like, I mean, I don't know. It was like, it was a record, at least in terms of like what humans have noticed, right? And like when people were reporting on it, it was like, oh, like whales carrying dead baby on its back for 3 days, and then it was like 8 days, and then it was like 14 days, and it just kept going. Yeah, until she finally dropped it.
Finally dropped it.
I think it just like dropped into like fell into the sea. Yeah.
Off, yeah.
Yeah.
For like 1,000 miles, I think.
Yeah.
Or something of great distances. There's a book coming out by the poet Ginger Coe that also references that whale, and I'm curious about. I mean, it's interesting that part of the story is that humans noticed, and that potentially this is something that whales do and have done. And I was thinking about, you read that chapter and I thought that alone is a whole book. I mean, that alone is like something that you could really meditate on for a lifetime and make connections and also feel very small when setting yourself against that kind of expression of grief. I was just wondering what that story or what that image. I mean, you wrote about it, but I guess I'm curious just to hear you talk about like what kind of meaning that has for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, like what you said, like I think it was really striking that humans noticed, like, and it's interesting, you know, humans will notice whenever animals are doing something that like looks human. We're like, oh my God, look at the whales also feel sad when their babies die. Like, and it seems so absurd. Like, well, obviously, right? But we look at it, and I think it says often more about us than it says about the other animals, right? Like, what is our fascination with that? There's a book called What Would Animals Say If We Asked the Right Questions by Vinciane Dupre. And it just looks at all of these things, like it just takes all these experiments that scientists have done where scientists are like, oh, these monkeys aren't intelligent because they didn't pass this test, and then she like breaks them all apart and is like just questions like, what does that even mean, right? Like the elephants that like paint in Thailand, right? Like how they've been trained by humans, and scientists have dismissed that because they're trained. And she points out, why is that a dismissal? Like the elephant still had to learn that skill, and that's still a great feat. And all humans are always wanting to like dismiss the like the brilliance of animals and their intelligence if it doesn't match like our particular standards. And like humans don't even match those standards, right? So like a lot of those same tests that like monkeys have failed, when we put humans through it, they also fail because they don't want to do it. Like they're like, you have to solve the puzzle this way, and humans are like, no way, I'm gonna do it my way. So they technically failed the test, right? Anyways.
I just want to return to something you said while you were reading. It was a total aside, I think, because you did mention before when we were talking the other night that for readings, you read primarily the animals.
Yeah.
The squirrels, the dog, the cat, the whales. And you said, this was a question, I think you said offhandedly, why are the humans more difficult? No, this is my question to you. You said the humans are harder to read out loud. I really liked the sound of that, because taken out of context, it just sounds like humans are harder to read out loud. But what, in addition to the human chapters being longer, what are some other ways that humans are harder to read out loud?
Yeah, I mean, mainly it is a matter of length, and they're hard to excerpt because they're long sentences. So like the chapter that I read, I think it's like 5 pages and is one sentence, so it's hard to excerpt in the middle of a sentence. And I think because the human sections, because of the sentences, tend to go on more tangents and meanderings in the consciousness. And so I think when someone's reading something like that out loud to you, it's a lot harder to track. Like you're losing track more in the moment. And yeah, there's also a lot more of the violence also happens in the human sections. And so I don't read those out loud usually in public. But yeah, so they're mostly practical reasons. But I also just like that I am decentering the human, and then people think that this is a book only about animals, but it's not. But I mean, humans are also animals, but that's not.
It's funny that you make that disclaimer, because it would be great to imagine that this book is just told from the perspective of animals. How do you? Untrue. I want to be mindful of time. I have, like you said, what is time? Maybe it's 11:39 p.m. But how do you think your book is doing? And I don't mean like how is it faring in the world, but if you were to imagine your book as a sentient being that has been in some sense emancipated from the burden of its writer, how do you think it's doing out there? Like, do you think it's enjoying its time out there in the social sphere?
So this is what I pictured in my head when you asked that question. I don't know if this answers it at all, but so I've talked about this book before. Like the analogy that I used was that it felt like when I wrote this, it felt like I was vomiting out a bunch of stuff. But instead of putting the vomit in the toilet and flushing it, which would be like the more normal thing to do, I decided it would be productive for me to really look closely at the vomit and like play with it and shape it and really investigate like everything that was in my vomit. And that's this book, right? That's what this is. So when you asked that question, what I imagined is like the vomit monster becoming alive and like running into the woods like a feral vomit monster, and it's like quite happy to be liberated like from me and not having me poke and prodded, and it's doing great, I think, like in the woods on its own, hanging out with Sasquatch. So I don't know. That's just what came to me, and I don't know. But maybe that's like I don't know a time, but maybe that's like a good place to end. With the vomit monster running off into the woods.
I mean, that's some pretty extraordinary vomit. Yeah, maybe that is a good place to end. It's a good place to begin. We should begin there. Is that what we're doing? Are we ending? Can I show you something real quick?
Yeah.
So when I read at Powell's, and you sat beside me and we had a conversation, there was a man in the audience named Bob Schlegel, who was the father of a friend of mine, and he painted us while we were there. He painted us.
Oh.
The sad part of the story is that he passed away earlier this year, but he gave me a book of that reading. So that's what I looked like. And then this is what you looked like.
Oh my God. Wow.
So yeah, he made I just wanted to share that.
That's so cool.
Yeah. So maybe there's somebody in the audience tonight that has been doing sketches. It is an art school after all.
I think Brandon's asking someone to draw him. So if anyone's drawn Brandon, please do share.
An assignment has been. Let's give Brandon Shimoda and Janice Lee a round of applause. Thank you, Brandon.
Yeah, thank you, Jay. Thank you so much, Janice.
Thank you.
All right, am I just saying goodbye? Goodbye.
Yeah, we'll say goodbye unless you want to hang out. We'll take you to the bar.
I feel like I'm a character in Pee-wee's Playhouse, actually.
We'll see you, Brandon. Thank you. Now we're going to go through my email.
Thank you so much. Oh, and please do take a tarot card with you on your way out. So.
Yeah, and we have books for sale.